Our immediate destination after leaving Scotland was the Faroe Islands, 200 miles away across the North Atlantic. Because of time constraints, we headed directly to Tórshavn, the capital of the country, which comprises 18 islands and is an autonomous county of Denmark. Local boats show their Viking heritage. The population of the Faroes is almost 50,000, of which around 19,000 live in the metropolitan area around Tórshavn. There is a small yacht harbour. Venture is tucked away to the left and cannot be seen in this view. Tórshavn is very cosmopolitan, and most people speak excellent English. An amazing network of roads links the majority of the islands, and most of our touring was done by car, through spectacular scenery almost entirely devoid of trees. Away from Tórshavn, the population still lives in small villages. Until the late 19th century, life was centered around each settlement, as communication between them was difficult and often fraught with danger due to the terrain and the unpredictable weather. Every harbour and road has been hard won, and the villages are dwarfed by their surroundings. Like most people, I knew little about the Faroes until I actually visited the country. Historians believe that the first parliament dates from AD 800, making it the first in Europe and probably the first in the world. Interestingly, DNA tests reveal that 87% of men are of Scandinavian origin, while 84% of women originate from Scotland and Ireland. Maybe Viking raids had something to do with that. Crew members on this leg were Steve D'Antonio, well known as a marine consultant and for his technical articles in Passage Maker magazine, and George Sass in the Green Jacket, an experienced professional photojournalist who accompanied us to Galapagos in Venture 1. All around is the restless ocean. Harbours have to be found where they can. In this case, no more than a cleft in the rocks. The name of the village that overlooks it is shown here. I'm not going to make any attempt to try to pronounce the name of the places we visited. Most villages have streams running through them, which is no doubt the reason they were built there in the first place. The national flower is the marsh marigold, and the national bird the oyster catcher, with its distinctive cry. We took a ferry to the remote island of Mykonos. Weather permitting, the small boat follows the dotted blue line, once in the morning and once in the late afternoon. But the tiny harbour is exposed to turbulent seas, and especially during winter, the island can be isolated for weeks at a time. It takes nerves and skill to spin the boat around in the confined space against the force of the surging surf. The boat is a lifeline for the residents and brings the necessities of life to the island. The steps up from the jetty are steep. cargo from the boat is moved with a quad and trailer. The weather in the Faroes can change from one minute to the next, but on the day of our visit to Mykonos it remained cold, wet and miserable. The island is surrounded by high cliffs, providing nesting sites for millions of puffins, which breed in burrows in the ground. This mist is actually a fine drizzle, which soon permeated our inadequate clothing. In no time we were thoroughly soaked, and so was all our camera gear. We chickened out on the 2-hour trek along the steep path to the lighthouse. We sheltered from the persistent rain inside this charming church. Local boats again showed their Viking heritage, and all were elaborately secured against the ferocious wind. They were pulled ashore up this near vertical slipway above the ferry landing. Flocks of kittiwakes gathered on the cliffs, and as the time approached for the ferry to return, the seas and the visibility had seriously deteriorated. But arrive she did, to the great relief of the waiting passengers, most of whom were a rambling group from the UK. My dictionary defines rambling as a leisurely country walk, seriously different to my way of thinking from the survival conditions hiking along the precipitous cliffs. Boarding meant timing it, to step aboard at the top of the swells as the boat heaved up and down. Those seated across the transom were in for a real drenching, as torrents of seawater swept over the cabin roof and cascaded over them. The wind is always present in these islands. This is the extreme north, and the island of Fugloy, like Mykonos, is only reachable by boat when weather permits. It is home to millions of seabirds, and 2 villages which are the most remote in the Faroes. This map shows the north-northwest to south-southeast orientation of the islands. Dotted lines show tunnels under the fjords and even under the mountains. Modern tunnels like this one are dual lane and have lighting. Older tunnels are single lane with pullouts and no lighting. It is possible to drive throughout the country. You can rent a car or even bring your own on a regular vehicular ferry service from Scandinavia. Back in Tórshavn, the car ferry Smyril, linking the port with the southern islands, was just leaving her berth, and it was time for us to leave also and head directly to Iceland. Our landfall would be Vestmannaeyjar, or the Westman Islands, south of Iceland, estimated distance about 350 nautical miles. It was blustery when we left the protection of the harbour. Good conditions for the traditional sightseeing sailboats. When we passed the Witch's Finger, our plotter showed that the TTG, time to go, as 1.4 days. At the time the picture was taken, we did not know that we were in for some unpleasant weather, which would reduce our speed over the ground and extend the transit time to just under 48 hours. Now at 64 degrees north on Midsummer's Day, the early dawn revealed dramatic views of the dangerous south coast of Iceland. Hidden in the clouds was the volcano that had caused so much disruption. After 48 hours underway, it was with great relief that we entered dramatic Jaime Harbour, where seabirds nested on every crevice in the towering cliffs. To add to the fun, we encountered the ferry in the narrow channel. The only pontoon big enough to take us was the fuel dock, where we moored, expecting to be asked to move, but we were allowed to stay there for the 2 days we were in port. It was blessedly calm. Venture towered over the surrounding boats. The island of Jaime is a volcanic hotspot, as evidenced by the lava mountain beyond the churchyard. Without warning, on the night of January the 23rd, 1973, the earth split open and fountains of lava buried 400 houses and required the rapid evacuation of all 5,000 residents of the island. We took our leave after 2 days in this interesting place. Past the island of Surtsey, which erupted from beneath the sea in November 1963. We encountered rough seas on our way to Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. Many imagine much of Iceland to consist of volcanoes belching steam and ash, but in reality, the valleys are filled with lush and beautiful farms. Although not originally native to Iceland, lupins are early colonizers of less fertile areas. Icelandic horses are unique in that they have 5 gaits instead of the usual 4. In AD 982, a law was passed forbidding the import of horses into the country, so the breed has remained pure for over 1,000 years. The best way to see the country is to head off the beaten track. For good reason, most routes are designated for 4-wheel drive only, and there are stiff penalties for venturing on them with a conventional vehicle. There are plenty of rivers to ford, and we rented a small 4-wheel drive Suzuki, which served us well. Wildflowers gain a tenuous foothold among volcanic rocks. The star-shaped leaves are young lupins. Lava fields are frequently cloaked with strange velvety moss. Fast-flowing streams carry silt from upstream before leaping over cliffs in a series of wonderful waterfalls. The largest in the south is the mighty Gullfoss. Near the town of Vik, meaning harbour, fields of wild lupins reach out towards bizarre rock formations. These, along with black beeches and fleshy angelica, bring to mind scenes from Jurassic Park. The church at Vik looked very different just 3 months earlier, when this area caught the edge of the fallout from the volcanic eruption. We saw plenty of evidence of the chaos wrought by the volcano, and we headed into the affected areas to see some of the destruction for ourselves. There were many streams and rivers to ford, and a modest breeze lifted the fine volcanic dust from the surface, reducing visibility to almost zero.
This is fun. It's dust. Stop somewhere behind you. Somewhere wherever you feel comfortable staying.
The ash had the gritty consistency of carborundum, but was as fine as talc, making it hard to follow the track and eventually forcing us to turn back. Work was still in progress to repair the levees, which had been swept away by snowmelt from the volcanic fires. Glacier walks are among the many opportunities for exploration in a monochrome landscape which oftentimes resembled the surface of the moon. In Geysir, steam floats above the wildflowers and boiling water bubbles from the ground. All other geysers, or geysers depending on your pronunciation, are named after the original, which sadly now has gone quiet, leaving the main attraction to Strucker, which shoots skyward every 5 minutes or so. Other volcanic curiosities closer to Reykjavik include the famous Blue Lagoon, which even on an overcast rainy day still managed to appear blue. But it was time for us to leave Reykjavik and head up the west coast towards Ólafsvík on the next leg of our circumnavigation of Iceland. It was a beautiful day when we took our leave. A small flotilla of locals went bobbing by as we passed through the harbour entrance. Just Chris and myself were on board for this leg of the trip. The Snæfell's ice cap was prominent on the horizon, while still 50 miles distant. We turned into Ólafsvík harbour, which was very commercial, and tied up against a wall of tyres for which there was no charge. We left the following day under a lowering sky. We were soon passing the Latrabrag cliffs, 14 kilometres long and 1,465 feet high. This was the most westerly point of our trip. In 1947, local farmers rescued all 12 crew members from a wrecked British trawler by lowering themselves on ropes and hauling them 680 feet up the cliffs. Headlands are a magnet for rough seas, and we found ourselves battling waves equaling those we had experienced on our approach to Iceland. But this time it was only for 3 hours, and we were more accustomed to the conditions. This was normal weather for boats much smaller in size than Venture. Towering mountains plummeted into the turbulent sea. U-shaped glaciated valleys were often home to a single isolated structure. The way into Tálknafjörður is eased by range markers on the shore. The harbour is protected by a sandbank which almost closes off the fjord, making it very secure. Seaweed prevented the anchor from holding, and the only place we could find to tie up was alongside a fishing trawler, for which we obtained permission. Fulmars were busy gleaning what they could from the nearby waters. We were now further north in Fairbanks in Alaska. When we left the following morning, the stack from an abandoned Norwegian whaling station stood out on the horizon. There are several of these discarded structures around the coast, and all that is left is a tall chimney and rusted boilers along the bleak shoreline. Once out of the protection of the fjord, we were again exposed to the rough conditions in the strait, dividing Iceland from Greenland. Conditions calmed as soon as we began our approach into Isafjorda. The town, huddling at the base of huge mountains, is the jumping-off spot for boats heading to Greenland. We were allocated a place on a floating pontoon, which was a rare treat in this part of the world. Isafjorda is served by an airport, and we were joined here by David, who had flown out from England. The rough conditions had scrambled the chain, and we used this opportunity to clear the jumble. There was a strong wind and the weather was cold. Greenland was only 130 miles away, and to the north there is nothing between here and the pole. A severe weather system with the lowest pressure for 10 years was forecast, and we were lucky to be moored in such a snug location. Gulls hung on the strong wind blowing 30 knots even within the inner harbour. Venture 2 was a heavy boat for the small pontoon, and Chris added extra lines from the nearby jetty to relieve the load. The wind was still strong when, after a delay of a couple of days, we got underway and passed the hanging valley that overlooks the town. The skyline was dominated by the shimmering Dranga ice cap. We were heading for Hornstrandir, the most remote area in all of Iceland, where there are no settlements, no roads, and no communications. Our immediate destination was the unsurveyed and uncharted fjord of Longafjorda, which had been recommended to us by a local yachtsman. The magic of Google Earth allows us to make a virtual flight up the fjord, but the real-world version was a place of pristine beauty, untarnished by the hand of man. A major waterfall at the head of the fjord filled the air with a soothing lullaby. As soon as the anchor was down, we launched the tender to see a diminutive venture dwarfed by the grandeur of her surroundings. That evening we celebrated with an excellent dinner of roast pork served with wine. As evening approached, the skies began to clear, and a lingering sunset, here filmed at midnight, settled its silent wings over the fjord. The following morning dawned clear and absolutely calm. Large numbers of beautiful jellyfish trailed their delicate tentacles through the pellucid water. We retrieved the anchor using the built-in nozzle to wash the chain. My solo excursion in the tender along the full length of the fjord to film Venture in her natural environment was a thrilling ride of sheer exhilaration, never to be forgotten. We ducked into another branch of the fjords where we encountered the only other cruising yacht we had met underway. Here was a scattering of buildings catering to hikers. Along the shore, the remains of another abandoned whaling station. We continued north along the rugged, uninhabited coast. This small structure is one of a series of refuge huts, marked here in red on this map. This beacon marked our furthest point from Southampton, about 1,550 miles as the crow flies, and just over 100 miles from Greenland. It would have been perfect weather to make the 12-hour crossing, but alas, we had to press on. We passed a series of towering cliffs, each home to countless numbers of seabirds. The shoreline in Hornvik Bay was littered with driftwood, which had, amazingly, originated in Siberia and reached these shores by way of the polar ice. This headland is the northern Cape Horn, and these cliffs, also home to millions of birds, drop vertically 1,760 feet sheer into the Greenland Sea. We were now only a couple of miles south of the Arctic Circle, and 3 weeks past the summer solstice. In a glow that never faded from the sky, a delicate sunset morphed into a matching sunrise, with the orb of the sun skimming the horizon. As the sun rose higher above the burnished surface of the sea, its golden rays painted the peaks of the nearby mountains. We headed south, 40 miles down the long fjord leading to Akureyri. This attractive city, lying in the shadow of the mountains, is the capital of the north, and Venture was allocated a convenient berth, right in the city centre. This is a port of call for cruise ships, one of which is seen here beyond the local boat club. Akureyri is surrounded by lush farmland with many horses. Haymaking was in full swing, and fields were dotted with white bales resembling giant marshmallows. In boggy areas, the fluffy heads of cotton grass nod and flutter in the breeze. We hired a car and toured this part of the country. We visited the fishing harbour of Ólafsfjörður. Local gulls clearly believed that the catch was for their benefit, but no one seemed to think it was worth the hassle of driving them away. En route to Lake Mývatn, we visited Godafoss, into which, legend has it, a local chieftain threw his pagan gods when he converted to Christianity in AD 1000. Just north of the lake is a vast volcanic area where steam hisses out of the ground and mud pots bubble and spurt. Close by, thermal energy has been harnessed to generate electricity. Steam roars out of the vents. This monster could be heard 3 miles away. The human figure on the hill gives scale to this explosion crater. Fields of frozen lava stretch to the horizon, and we meandered through an active volcanic area where wisps of steam rise all around. We now headed 40 miles offshore to remote Grimsey Island. Only 2 miles in area, with just 100 inhabitants, its main claim to fame is that it lies on the Arctic Circle. We arrived over a weekend so that we could tie up at the ferry terminal. The tiny harbour is built like a fortress against the fury of the ocean. Most of the male population came to look at adventure, and one kindly offered to drive us around the island. Our first stop was the marker for the Arctic Circle. Our guide is on the right, with Chris and crew members Brian and Val, who had joined us from Vancouver. All along the shore was more driftwood from Siberia, and at last we were able to see close up the puffins who had been eluding us at every stage of our journey. These comical little birds live in burrows in the ground. Our guide then led us by the hand part way down the cliffs to what he called a secret place. The following day we circumnavigated the island so we could observe these same cliffs from the sea. One of the fishermen was very insistent we took him along. We crossed the Arctic Circle, which is generally considered 66 degrees 33 minutes. He was also very keen to take the helm. After dropping him back at the harbour, we continued on our way. This church on Grimsey was built using driftwood. We entered the busy and attractive town of Husavik and picked our place to tie up. As usual, someone appeared out of the blue to take our lines. Husavik is a centre for whale watching, and many traditional boats filled the harbour. But sadly, we did not see any whales. We had been told in Grimsey that the warming ocean temperatures had caused them to move further north. From here we drove to Dettifoss, billed as the most powerful waterfall in Europe. Its waters were grey with sediment from the glacier which fed it. Slightly downstream were a pair of smaller falls which anywhere else would have been major attractions in their own right. Back at sea we rounded the northeast tip of Iceland and once again crossed the Arctic Circle, this time slightly north of our previous position. We celebrated the occasion by adding champagne to our orange juice.
Thank you. Just some champagne.
From now on, we would be heading south all the way back to Southampton. We visited Volpnafjordur, where we passed a large fishing trawler on our way into the harbour. The chief engineer and 2 others came to call on us after we tied up and invited us to visit their ship, which we were delighted to do. The following day we continued south into Seyðisfjörður, our last fjord and final port before leaving Iceland. Seyðisfjörður is the destination for the weekly car ferry between Iceland and Scandinavia. So if you bring your own vehicle to Iceland, this is the port at which you will arrive. The ferry only stayed a few hours. This is a ship which has to cope with some tough sea conditions. The season was advancing, and we had to be back in Southampton by the end of August, in time for the International Boat Show. We topped up our fuel from a tanker truck, which had brought fuel over the mountains from the next fjord. We headed out into the North Atlantic for the 500-mile crossing direct to Scotland. Time to go is shown on the plotter as 2.2 days. Homeward bound after circumnavigating Iceland, we passed the Mull of Kintyre and Sand Island Lighthouse, en route to Troon on the Scottish mainland. A fierce wind favoured the kite surfers, but presented us with steep head seas. We passed the crags of Ailsa Craig, number 3 in the list of top gannet colonies we had visited. With time running short, we headed down the Irish Sea directly to Milford Haven in southwest Wales. We covered the 253 miles in 25 hours and locked through into the marina. Like many ports we visited, the town had a memorial to fishermen lost in the rough seas that regularly battered the coast. From here we made direct passage to Land's End at the southwest tip of England, where the waters of the Celtic Sea meet those of the infamous English Channel. Perched on an offshore rock, Longship's lighthouse stands 114 feet above the waves, but not, as this photo shows, above their reach. With the corner turned, the seas were from aft, and we made for the Cornish town of Foy. Legend has it that a young Jesus Christ visited the town with his uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a tin merchant. Punch's Cross commemorating this belief was erected on these rocks more than 500 years ago. Modern structures nestle alongside a blockhouse built in 1380. Cornwall was an exporter of tin as long ago as 1600 BC and is still an important supplier of china clay. Surprisingly large ships still navigate through the picturesque harbour. A small ferry crosses the narrow channel, and at high tide we took the tender 7 miles up the Foy River. We passed grey-lag geese and other water birds as we drifted through this slice of rural England. Our last port of call was Dartmouth, which we had twice visited in the past. Our arrival coincided with our annual regatta. The harbour was abuzz with frenetic activity, and the shore fringed with crowds of people. Dartmouth is the home of the Royal Naval College, and the Navy had a presence both ancient and modern. Venture was tied up next to a cluster of vintage lifeboats, and rafting was on a scale seldom encountered. The regatta culminated with a spectacular firework display, at which we had a front row seat. We felt it might almost have been organized for our benefit, to mark the successful conclusion of an epic trip. The following morning, nature provided a more subtle display of her own as Chris untangled the mooring lines. Navigation markers warned of dangers along the treacherous coast, littered with shipwrecks dating back as far as the Bronze Age. The English Channel was in a rare benign mood as we approached the Isle of Wight and the Needles. Soon we were turning into the Itchen River. As we passed beneath the bridge, the spring of heather on the jackstaff proclaimed we had been north of Ardnamurchan Point. Indeed, just 6 weeks earlier we had been above the Arctic Circle. "10 days later, Venture was on display at the Southampton International Boat Show, with no evidence that she had just returned from a cruise to Ireland, Scotland, the Faroes, and the circumnavigation of Iceland, during which we had travelled 4,677 nautical miles over 134 days.